So what we're going to learn today, this is, we're finally jumping straight into the training. Everything about SQL Server licensing. No, not every single bit. I mean, we won't go nitty-gritty into scenarios that only occur less than 1% of the time. But what you will take out today is the core knowledge of SQL Server 2022 licensing. And Microsoft made some significant changes into SQL Server 2022 licensing compared to SQL Server 2019. So I will highlight those. I will highlight the most critical bits, and if we have time, we'll discuss them as well. Those bits. So yeah, I mean, thanks for joining. We have not very many people. Usually, it attracts about 100 at least. We have 32 people now watching, if my count is correct on the restream. So please say hello. Please ask your questions. If you're watching the recording, by the way, if you'll be watching the recording of this video, there'll be chapters to each section of the training. So please use them freely. Those who watch live cannot do that, but those of you who watch the recording, it's a very useful feature. A disclaimer, so we're not Microsoft, we're not affiliated with Microsoft, we're not paid by Microsoft, we don't care about, it's a nice technology company, but I don't care about Microsoft. Everything that you see here, everything that's mentioned here, it's our experience through practical application, through practical engagements. I did hundreds of effective licensing positions, almost 100 enterprise agreement renewals myself, audit defense exercises up to 50, including service provider ones. So if I say something that's important, trust me, it is. If I skip something, it's probably not that important. However, if you have a question about something I'm missing, ask it in the chat. Always, 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 always consult with Microsoft product terms. For if you have any doubts, whatever I tell you today, Microsoft product terms should become your go-to, like licensing Bible, go-to place to go and read all about Microsoft licensing terms and conditions. If it's not there, it doesn't exist. Simple as that. Hi, Elisa. Nice to see you here. Right. I'll ask you one question, which is absolutely optional. You don't have to respond, but I'll be interested. What's the oldest SQL Server version that runs in your estate? And we'll quickly skip through, so take your time to type it in the chat. I'll give you a bit of concepts for those of you who, especially people are in procurement or in finance, or just joining this world of ITAM. You may not necessarily know everything, and don't be shy. I mean, nobody's asking you whether you know those or don't. I'll walk you through some basic concepts so you'll then understand what I'm talking about. Anyway, if during the training you'll hear something from me that I didn't explain, or you want an explanation, again, please don't be shy asking. I will explain that. Hello. Right. We're getting answers. 2012. Nice. Thanks, Nicole. So virtualization, dive in quickly. So when I'm going to be talking about virtual machines, what that is. A server is a hardware box. And that hardware box runs a physical operating system. Why is it called physical operating system? Because it's the physical box. It's like the one that you can touch. It's physical. Inside that physical operating system, you may run virtual machines, which are essentially just pretend computers. They're called virtual machines. Virtual machines themselves have virtual operating systems in them. So that's what virtualization is basically. So inside that box, you can have like 4, 5, 20 pretend computers with their own computer names, with their own computer configurations, all in one box. That is what virtual machines are. Good question. What is QMTH? That is provider related. And by the way, since October 2022, this year, it's 1st of October 2022, you can forget about it. I'm being serious. I'm not being sarcastic. Just forget about QMTH. Right. So moving on about virtualization. So these computers usually called host because it hosts virtual machines, which are sometimes also called guests. So when I say guest virtual machine, that's what it means. Just basically virtual machine. So please don't overcomplicate it in your mind. Multiple hosts can be combined in clusters. For what reason? Is basically if one host fails, virtual machines move to another host. So what I'd like you to remember from this slide, if you haven't watched our dedicated videos about virtualization, is look at the licenses right now. So those document icons on the slide, licenses. The first host has 2 virtual machines and 2 licenses assigned. The second host has 1 virtual machine and 1 license assigned. Everything is fine. But the whole idea about clusters is that licenses move around. Sorry, virtual machines move around, but licenses sometimes cannot. So when I'll be talking about license mobility, that's an ability of a license to move together with the virtual machine. Because in the Microsoft world, you do not assign licenses to virtual machines. In a tool, you can kind of virtually assign it to virtual machine. But then in any audit, in any kind of review, the auditors will approach it from the Microsoft standpoint, which is a license must be assigned to a host. And if it needs to move with the virtual machine to another host in real time, it needs to have specific rights that allow that. Otherwise, it's not allowed. So please remember that. Please remember that. And that's when we get to virtual licensing, I'll mention this again. We have a few more hi and hellos. I'll put them on screen so it's all interactive and nice. Hi, nice to see people from Philippines. I mean, it's in this late hour for you, I guess. Nice. Containers. Containers are, I mean, they've gained popularity a few years ago, or they're still there. You know, people use containers a lot. So what is a container? A virtual machine is essentially like a new computer, like a fully new computer. A container is an application wrapped into like a bubble. I won't explain to you what that is actually, but it still runs inside the actual operating system. So it's isolated from all the other applications and aspects of the operating system, but it's not a fully isolated virtual machine. And containers can be inside the physical operating system, like on this slide, and containers can also be nested in. Why can't I click anything? In virtual machines. So inside they can be also inside virtual machines, which is a bit bizarre, but well. And SQL Server licensing is very sensitive to containers. And it's very sensitive to where that container is, in the physical operating system or in a virtual operating system. And I have a very complex slide that I put together today that shows you why that is now important. And Microsoft actually made it worse for SQL Server 2022. It was easier before. Before, every container, you would have treated it as just another virtual machine. Now it's not as simple, which is economically a good change. But you know, I'm jumping too much up front. So coming up next, so the next part that we're going to be talking about right now is SQL Server licensing models. You know, the basics of SQL Server licensing, access licensing, and calculating licenses. So your basic information about how to calculate the license for SQL Server without going deep into variations. SQL Server can be licensed, may be licensed in 2 ways, in 2 manners. The first one is called server/cal. However, I always call it server plus cal because it requires a server license, 1 license per server basically, and client access licenses. So both of them. It's not a choice between the server and the cal. And right now, in the current version of SQL Server 2022, only SQL Server Standard has that licensing model. If your organization bought SQL Server Enterprise many years ago in this model before 2012, you may continue renewing that SQL Server Enterprise in that licensing model, but you may not buy new licenses like that. since 1st of April 2012. So long time ago, more than 10 years. But some organizations still maintain that renewed software assurance, and they still maintain that licensing model. These days, again, if you go ahead and want to buy new licenses, the only edition that supports this licensing model is SQL Server Standard. SQL Server BI was a historical also version, edition that appeared for a few versions and then disappeared again. SQL Server per core licensing model does not require client access licenses. But instead of licensing SQL per server, you license every single core. And there are specific formulas and minimums and caveats how you calculate the required number of SQL Server core licenses. And both current commercial editions, Standard and Enterprise, both of those editions support that licensing model. Right. So thanks about the question about containers. I'll take it a bit later. I have it here on my screen. So yeah, a reminder: don't be afraid to ask your questions. So current version of SQL Server is 2022, only recently released, roughly like 1 month ago, I think. Previous versions are 2019, 2017, 2016, 2014, and I emphasize this in every training. These numbers are versions. There's no such thing as an enterprise version. There's no such thing as a standard version. Standard and enterprise, developer and express are called editions. Edition is the size of the package, the number of features you get, and the price. A version is just a sequence. Was it new or was it old? Please don't confuse them ever, because you'll confuse the hell out of other people if you do that. However, I blame Google, because if you search for something on Google for a version of something, they'll also show you results with editions, which is absolutely, anyway, it's not correct. So versions and editions differ. So in addition to commercial editions currently available, enterprise and standard, there are other editions currently available as well, one of which is SQL Server Developer. We won't go too deep into detail about SQL Server Developer today. We'll have a separate training about developer tools. What you need to remember about SQL Server Developer is that it's entirely free. It's a downloadable thing. All you need to do is you need to register. Every user that downloads it needs to register. That's it. And the other thing you need to remember about it is that it's not allowed for any production workloads. So it's free, but for design, development, testing, you name it. So no production workloads, no access to production data, just development, basically. And SQL Server Express free of charge and no strings attached at all. So no kind of hidden caveats and limitations of for example, like with Visual Studio Community, you may not use it if you have more than 250 employees. SQL Server Express doesn't have such limitations. It's truly and completely free. That could be your option, by the way, for many projects. Instead of installing a commercial SQL, if you only require basic features, go with SQL Server Express. Downgrades and down editions. So I remind the versions 2022, 2019, 2017, blah, 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 and 2012, 2008, SQL Server 7. So in volume licensing and CSP, you can downgrade. If you buy today SQL Server 2022 license, you can downgrade the instance to any of the previous versions. In regards to editions, it's a bit more complicated. But what you need to know is the basic rule is that if you assign a SQL Server Enterprise license to a host, for example, you can run both SQL Server Enterprise and SQL Server Standard instances inside virtual machines on that host. So down editioning from Enterprise to Standard is possible. Down editioning from Standard to Enterprise is not possible. Why? Because Standard is below Enterprise. So there's no down edition. It's a smaller edition, so you cannot use standard licenses to license a SQL Server Enterprise instance unless it's an Azure, but we'll get to that. We have an Azure section today as well. Right. So SQL Server CALs are always required in the server plus CAL licensing model. In the per core licensing model, client access licenses are not required. So the way it works in the server/CAL licensing model is you license servers with server licenses, and then you license either all users that require access to SQL, not middle tier, no multiplexing, end users and end devices. You license them all with CALs, and thus you get your SQL Server estate licensed in this particular licensing model. What's important to know is that CALs, SQL Server CALs, are never bundled in any other CALs, and they don't have any CAL equivalencies. So SQL Server CAL must always be explicitly purchased as SQL Server CAL. Office 365 does not include SQL Server CALs. Core CAL bundle or Enterprise CAL bundle, they do not include SQL Server CALs either. So SQL Server CALs must be bought always explicitly. There are no external connectors. So if you know what external connectors are, there are no external connectors to SQL Server. And the question that we get often is, okay, but I can't count the end users of my solution. It's the whole internet. If it's the whole internet, if there are external users or something like it, strictly speaking, over the threshold of about 20 users per instance of SQL Server, it's cheaper and it's easier to go with the core licensing model. License the cores per the formulas that we'll discuss a bit later, and you don't need to count users and devices accessing server. It's a good question. So how can we optimize SQL Server licenses? We will discuss that closer to the end of today's session. So please, if you have particular questions, because I will talk about 6 or 7 top things there. But if you have any particular questions, please ask them when we get to that section, please. Okay. What you also need to remember about CALs is that what's not on this slide, so please listen carefully to me right now, is in many cases, if there's a licensing right or a feature that requires software assurance on the actual SQL Server license, on the instance license, most certainly it also requires software assurance on CALs. So there are exceptions, but that's the general rule. So if you want to benefit from, say, SQL failover, then your CALs need to be also covered with software assurance, not just instances. It's important. Versions as well. So obviously the newer version applies to any older versions, but not vice versa. So you may not use CAL 2016 to access SQL Server 2019, as on this slide. Simple as that. It's very simple. It must be the same version or higher. Now we get into a more complicated bit, which is, by the way, directly related to calculating licenses and optimizing SQL Server licenses. And that is the number of instances that you are allowed to run under a license. So again, we'll start with the Server plus CAL licensing model, in which when you license the servers, you assign one license to each, say, operating system. And rules differ here, whether that's standard or enterprise. You may notice that enterprise without a say or enterprise with a say, the rules are exactly the same. Are they? Yes, they are. Actually, yes, they are. When you assign SQL Server standard licenses to an instance of SQL Server, what you do is you essentially assign it to the operating system in which the SQL Server runs. And under that one license, inside the same operating system, not an additional virtual machines, no, in that operating system, one VM or one physical, you may run an unlimited number of SQL Server instances. What it means for cost savings is, if you have 2, 3, 4 very similar applications, applications with very similar SQL Server requirements. For example, they all require SQL Server Standard 2019. You may install SQL Server 4 times in the same operating system under one license. Instances, they're called SQL Server instances. They'll have different instance names. They can have different configurations. If any of you here on the call is a DBA, or you know about stuff like collation orders, or different model database, master database designs, they're like separate SQL servers, but inside one operating system, they can be covered with one license, which is beautiful, brilliant. And this is one of the cost savings tips when some organizations, when they have very homogeneous set of SQL servers, they forfeit virtualization and put hardware clusters, very capable hardware clusters in place, thus saving massively on licenses. There are drawbacks. For example, maintenance is more difficult, and obviously a failure of one node may affect, one instance may affect other instances as well. So that may affect all the other applications. But with good planning, proper strategic planning of those clusters, there are some very, I can't call the names because that's NDA, but there are some very respectable organizations in the United Kingdom, for example, that went for this model, that actually that are not far from stock trading. So you can imagine how important that is. And that was a very good cost-saving tip for them. Enterprise without software assurance. So server count, remind you, the one that you cannot buy, but you may still maintain. The problem with that model is, you can always read from this slide, but the problem with that model is you're always limited by 20 maximum cores, which means, strictly speaking, that you're always limited by the choice of hardware. And if you, and especially importantly, whether you use hyper-threading or not, because you are actually limited by the number of 20 hardware threads. If you enable hyper-threading, you may not use a server that has more than 10 physical cores in total. It's as bad as that. So I don't see anyone these days deploying it in this way. So we won't waste too much time on this slide. Take a screenshot. Those of you who are on the training mailing list, you will receive a PDF with the slides. So you have it in front of you. You won't find that in Microsoft product terms, currently in the online version. To find those rules in Microsoft product terms, you need to go to the product terms archive and download product terms for November 2019. That is the last place where Microsoft published those rules for Enterprise, SQL Server Enterprise, licensed with the Server Pascal licensing model. Now we get into even more interesting area, especially for those of you who use containers heavily. Anything that is yellow here did not exist as a rule for SQL Server 2019. This is all new for SQL Server 2022. And I'll explain you the differences now. Let's go one by one because it's important. If you have SQL Server standard licenses for SQL Server 2022 standard, you may not assign them without software assurance. You may not assign them to virtual machines anymore. That was allowed for SQL Server 2019, 17, 16, 14, 12. Now you must have software assurance. So see the bottom left cell, option not available as they required. So you may not license per VM or per container without software assurance. It requires now active software assurance or a CSP subscription, which is an equivalent. If you license physical cores at the physical level, that covers all the instances inside the physical operating system, but no virtual machines, no containers. So only instances inside the physical or SE. If you want to license containers, you must go or virtual machines per VM with core licenses. You must acquire SQL Server Standard licenses with software assurance. We're talking about SQL Server Standard instances. SQL Server Standard with software assurance, if you license physical cores, the physical operating system, then you get unlimited instances in the physical operating system, inside the operating system itself. But containers, even deployed in the same operating system, are treated as they were separate virtual machines. So you must treat them as separate virtual machines, which is completely different. And I don't know why. It's mind-boggling. When you assign SQL Server Standard license with software assurance to virtual machines, because then any containers inside that virtual machine are unlimited. That is, by the way, a cost-saving option now, because previously, for SQL Server 2019, all containers, whether inside the physical operating system or a virtual operating system, they all were treated as separate virtual machines, and they all required separate sets of licenses. Now, actually, that is a discount. So if you pay for active software assurance, if you have an enterprise agreement, or you have a CSP subscription, and that's how you license your SQL service, you'll pay less. And by the way, review your estate right now if you have any used containers. That's a good feature. So, enterprise, SQL Server Enterprise without software assurance. Let me start backwards. So, SQL Server Enterprise is usually pitched by Microsoft like license every core on the physical host, and then run unlimited number of virtual machines and containers on the physical host of both enterprise and standard. That is true. That's why I want to kind of start backwards. That is true when you have software assurance. It's truly unlimited. It's just you don't need to count containers. You don't need to count, virtual machines. When you have software assurance, you license on the physical cores, and then you can run any SQLs inside that host. If you don't have software assurance, there's one limit: the number of virtual machines and containers with SQL Server that may be run under that licensing model may not be more than the number of core licenses assigned to the host. So, for example, if you have a 24 core host and you license it this way, the entire host with SQL Server Enterprise, then the number, but you don't have software assurance, then the number of virtual machines is limited by 24. It's ridiculous, but that's the rule. That's the rule. Usually, though, what we see in practice is that if somebody goes for unlimited virtualization, they go properly with SQL Server Enterprise with software assurance. And if you assign SQL Server Enterprise licenses to individual virtual machines, you need to pay attention to how containers are treated. Without software assurance, all containers are treated as separate virtual machines. With software assurance, all the containers inside the virtual machine are unlimited. So in heavily containerized environments, SQL Server Enterprise with software assurance could suddenly become cheaper. Excuse me. How do we calculate licenses? That was, by the way, the most complicated slide in this entire training. The rest is easier. How do you calculate core licenses? So when you license physical servers, just explain to you, and at the physical level, if you want to license either a standalone server or a server with SQL Server Enterprise for unlimited virtualization, that's how you calculate it. So step number one, you count all the physical CPUs in the box. Then you count, look at the characteristics of those CPUs, count physical cores in one CPU, and then you assign at least 4 licenses per CPU. If you use any hardware that was produced in the last 10 days, 10 years, excuse me, then I would not even imagine that you will find a server that has less than 4 cores per CPU. So, strictly speaking, with all the modern servers, you simply count all the cores in the server and this is how many licenses you need. So that minimum of 4 is very, very outdated. Hopefully Microsoft won't increase it. But if you have legacy hardware, which I've seen, for example, a 4 processor server, and each processor is like a old Xeon with 1 core, then unfortunately you need 16 licenses for that server because there's a minimum of 4 licenses per physical socket. But then again, 99% of you will be just counting the total number of cores in the server. And for those of you who are Excel freaks, the formula at the bottom of the slide is something you can type into your Excel. And there you go. That's how we calculate the licenses. When you license per virtual machine or container, it is a little bit different. You don't need to count vCPUs. You need to count vCPUs. You need to count virtual cores, which are sometimes also called vCPUs, sometimes maybe called something else. Basically, the smallest fraction available to your virtual machine. And that number of virtual cores or virtual CPUs is the number of licenses with the minimum of 4. So again, if there's a 2 virtual core virtual machine, you still need 4 licenses. So that is the thing you will probably encounter often, because admins deploy 2 vCPU virtual machines, put SQL Server on them. From the commercial standpoint, it kind of makes no sense because give it at least 4 because that's the minimum of licenses, and the virtual machine will run better if it makes sense. Again, you count the virtual CPUs or vCores. You count the second caveat. You count how many hardware threads are mapped to each vCPU. So these are the official rules. If your virtual CPUs are supported by more than 2, say, hardware threads, more than 1 hardware thread, then you need to count hardware threads. But most of the popular hypervisors like Hyper-V and VMware, if you enable hyperthreading at the host, you have to reboot it to enable it. And you reboot it, all the vCPUs will remap to a single hardware thread. So you will never run into this hyperthreading problem in traditional hypervisors. Which doesn't mean like that there are no other hypervisors, but they're very rare. So again, 99% of you will not have to even bother about calculating hardware threads supporting each virtual CPU. What you just need to remember is count the vCores in the virtual machine, and remember there's a minimum of 4 licenses. Simple as that. And you have an Excel formula. Where it may immensely confuse you, and it confuses everyone, including my partner Daryl, is because licenses are sold in 2 core packs. So what you need to remember is a 2 core pack is a pack of 2 licenses. Simple as that. So you may not buy less. So the smallest that you buy is a 2 core pack. It's a single pack containing 2 licenses. Where it may be confusing, sometimes people just say, oh, you need 2 licenses. Clarify that. Did you mean single licenses or did you mean packs? Especially people who are far from licensing and IT, but more in procurement and commercial. They operate, they use the term license for the pack. You may suddenly overpay. You may suddenly pay twice for the licenses. If I tell you, for example, you need 88 licenses, and you place an order for 88 2 core packs, what you will buy in the end is 176 licenses. Clarify that. Always clarify whether a calculation is done in packs or in licenses. What is that number you're looking at? Required licenses. Microsoft's guides, product terms, anything from Microsoft talks about single core licenses. But they sell them in packages of 2. Yeah, don't ask me why. So, as I said before, license must be assigned to hosts. And if you don't have software assurance, or a CSP subscription, the license must stay on the host for 90 days. So if you use SQL Server, here's a practical advice. If you use SQL Server in virtual clusters with multiple hosts, assume, unless you know what you're doing and you use host affinity or something like it, assume that you require software assurance. Especially now with SQL Server 2022, where standard may not be assigned to virtual machines without software assurance anyway. And when you have software assurance or CSP subscription, then this rule of 90 days does not apply. Then the license may travel with the virtual machines all over the place. I hope it's clear. If you, by the way, if you want more on these concepts of licensability and core licenses and hardware metrics, please watch the first Microsoft Licensing Basics episode of this training. You can watch both, either from the 2021 or the recently recorded one from 2022, because that's where we explain them really well, really in deep detail. I have a question for you, by the way, after this long part of the training. How many core licenses do you need for a 2-core virtual machine? Please answer in the chat. I'll leave it for a few seconds. Whilst you're rereading this and calculating the licenses, please, if you like what's going on here right now, please click like on the YouTube video. I would really appreciate that. By smashing that like button, you're helping me, you're helping this channel, and you're helping other people who may be looking for the same information, because that's how YouTube works. Basically, you please the YouTube algorithm. Okay, so whilst you are still thinking about the answer to this question, we'll continue with SQL Server in Azure, in Azure, and however else various parts of the world call it, Microsoft Azure, as we call it in the United Kingdom. SQL Server licenses with software assurance, active software assurance, and CSP subscription licenses for SQL Server may be taken to Azure. So sorry, I was looking at your answers and it was a bit confused. The answer here there is simple. It's one machine with 2 cores. You need 4 cores. Anyway, moving on to going back to Azure Hybrid Benefit for SQL Server. SQL licenses, again with active SA or the CSP subscriptions, may be assigned to Azure virtual machines with the minimum of 4 licenses per virtual machine. It's when we match standard to standard or enterprise to enterprise. There are various options of how to assign those licenses, but that's the basic rule, basically. They may not be used simultaneously on-premise and in Azure, so you have to actually move them to Azure, with the exception of when you move them for the first time, when you lift and shift your applications, when you migrate your data from on-premises to Azure, you have a 180 days window during which you may use those licenses simultaneously. A one-way migration from on-prem to Azure, 180 days, that is allowed. When that time expires, you must unassign them from either on-premise or Azure. You must decide whether you want to go with pay-as-you-go on Azure, for example, or you want to forfeit, abandon the licenses for the on-premise because you've decommissioned the service. The choice is up to you. So, but otherwise, there's no simultaneous use. SQL Server in Azure itself comes in 3 flavors. So, infrastructure as a service, that just pure virtual machines, usual virtual machines, with SQL Server installed in them. And platform as a service comes in two flavors: managed SQL Server instances and SQL Server database. So AHAB, as far as I remember, I may be wrong here, works for both. I practically myself only used AHAB on virtual machines and managed instances, not on databases. How do you calculate licenses for Azure? For Azure, importantly, a minimum of 4 cores per platform as a service virtual machine or platform as a service instance of IaaS virtual machine. I haven't that type on the slide. If you need more cores, you assign more cores. Simple as that. If you have an 8-core virtual machine, you need to assign 8 cores. Interestingly, that only in Microsoft Azure, and this is one of the what we call unfair competitive advantages of Microsoft, you may actually assign SQL Server standard licenses to SQL Server enterprise instances, but you need to multiply them by 4. And that's only available in Azure, not on hosting, not on bring your own license, not on premise. And on dedicated hosts, you get unlimited virtualization, which is exactly the same as on premise. Here are a few examples. So here we have a SQL Server Enterprise virtual machine with 8 virtual cores. Option 1 is straightforward. It's SQL Server Enterprise. Therefore, by default, you would probably assume that applying 8 SQL Server Enterprise licenses using one-to-one is correct, and that would be correct. That's the correct way of licensing it. But what if you don't have SQL Server Enterprise licenses, but you have lots of unused SQL Server standard licenses with software assurance or on a CSP subscription? In that case, you multiply the required number of licenses by 4, and you may license this virtual machine in Azure using Azure Hybrid Use Benefit rights with 32 SQL Server standard licenses. It works backwards with SQL Server Standard. So for this machine, I would say the default option is option number 2, straightforward option. This is the SQL Server Standard instance. So you assign 8 licenses to that machine of SQL Server Standard. But you may also assign 2 SQL Server Enterprise licenses, because how do you calculate them? You divide them by 4. And by the way, if you look at the price list, that is a cheaper option here. Using 2 SQL Server two SQL Server Enterprise licenses is usually cheaper in such circumstances. Right, so I'll take some questions. By dedicated hosting in private cloud instances, yes, that's what I mean. That's what I mean. When because half of my time I support service providers, and when we say dedicated, it means dedicated hardware, not dedicated parts of private clouds or something like it. No. So that is dedicated hardware to a particular user, whatever it's called in Azure. I don't remember it. I think it's always been called Azure dedicated host, but please correct me if I'm wrong. Same rules apply to managed instances. When you think general purpose or hyperscale, think SQL Server Standard. Same rules apply. When you think about business critical instances, think SQL Server Enterprise. Same rules apply. So you may mix and match licenses like this. I would, by the way, sorry, when I said mix and match, let me retract that. I would mix and match licenses. I would go with one version, one edition of licenses assigned to that, to one instance. Let's not confuse Microsoft, and let's not piss them off, because they can be easily pissed off by that. Unlimited virtualization only works in Azure dedicated hosts, as I mentioned, only works with SQL Server Enterprise licenses, and the same licensing rules applies on premise, so nothing different. It's unlimited virtualization. Right. I have a question. hope you can answer it in the chat. Can you assign SQL Server licenses to a SQL Server Enterprise virtual machine in Azure? A, yes. B, no. And a quick reminder, if you haven't yet clicked liked on this stream on YouTube, please do. Please do. And coming up next, SQL Server bring your own license. So may you and how you may take your licenses to a hosting provider. So obviously, I mean, the default option on the hosting provider is to rent it from them. But in some cases, you may take your licenses and you need to notify the provider though, and use those licenses on a third-party platform, including from the 1st of October 2022, including shared public cloud environments. Going back to the question, as I'm starting to get responses. Yes, you may. I just said you just apply the multiplier of 4, and you can do it. Right. So there's a big difference between taking your licenses to so-called listed providers and all the other providers. Listed providers are Amazon AWS, Google Cloud, Alibaba Cloud, and Microsoft Azure. So appreciating that Azure has its own unfair competitive advantage of Azure Hybrid Use Benefit, you may still utilize the rules of license mobility through software assurance. Now, let's look at the rules. So if hardware is dedicated to your own use, so for example, Azure dedicated hosts or whatever they call in Google, also dedicated hosts in Google, dedicated virtual, dedicated private cloud. So private cloud, hardware dedicated to you. If you bought licenses before the 1st of October 2019, you may take them to that hardware, just follow all the other on-premises licensing rules. But if licenses were purchased later, then they require software assurance. That's first thing. And then you may not take CSP subscription licenses to any of the listed providers. So only licenses with software assurance may be taken to listed providers. Again, Amazon, Google, Alibaba, and Azure with caveats. In regards to virtual machines in shared multi-tenanted environments, so public cloud, you may still, as well, if you want to, instead of Azure Hybrid Benefits, assign licenses with software assurance only to virtual machines. So that's possible. Same licensing rules apply again as on-premise in regards to calculating the required core licenses. Unfortunately, again, you may not do that with CSP subscription licenses. Nicole has a suggestion. Amazon is a listed provider. All Amazon. Okay, so if Nicole, the actual answer from Microsoft is like this. There's a document that is called "Here are the listed providers," and what they have in that document is, and I was wrong when I said it just AWS, because it says Microsoft, Amazon, Alibaba, and Google, without specifying any divisions of those or different cloud platforms. They basically name the brands: Amazon, Google, Alibaba, and Microsoft. So in that case, everything under the Amazon brand is a listed provider. That's my conviction. Because it's a downloadable Word file this long. Here are the listed providers, and that's the list. taking your licenses to other service providers is easier now, starting from 1st of October 2022. So those who are not listed, any other provider. I mean, now you don't even need to check whether that provider is a licensed mobility partner. Any provider, if they wish to ask them, they may tell you, no, we just don't want your licenses. But if they allow bringing your own licenses, then you can take your licenses to them. The only thing you need to remember is if you're taking your licenses to shared multi-tenant public cloud infrastructure, so you're renting virtual machines on shared hardware, those licenses must have either active software assurance or a CSP subscription. Other types of licenses may not be taken to shared environments. On dedicated hardware, for example, colocation, or you just rent racks or service from them, there's no limit for bring your own license. It's treated exactly the same as if it was your on-premises hardware. So all the on-premises rules apply to dedicated hardware, no limits. What about access to SQL Server on service providers? That depends on how SQL Server is licensed. So per core licenses, as on-premise, don't require any CALs or SALs at all. If we're talking about SQL Server plus CAL or plus SAL in SPLA, then in that case, client licenses are required. And on a pay-as-you-go model, you just pay it to the provider and they charge you for SALs. Simple. So there's no bring your own license. But if you want to bring your own license, if they permit you, other rules permit doing that, the CALs that you're going to use for that also require software assurance. So not only server licenses require software assurance, CALs also require software assurance. So please remember that. Coming up next, we're getting closer to the end of this training, by the way. Let's talk about SQL Server Fail-over licensing. So SQL Server Fail-over, if you have an enterprise agreement or you pay for CSP subscription licenses and you have so-called passive nodes and you don't discount them, you're doing it wrong. You're paying too much. So when you have licenses on an active subscription with Microsoft, SQL Server licenses, you may run up to 3 instances basically for free for each licensed instance. And I'll read from the slide because I don't remember them from top of my head. So one instance, which is the typical what we call a passive active passive configuration, it's a clustered pair of 2 nodes. If one node fails, the other one immediately starts working as an active node, completely transparent to end users, and that is called high availability. So there's no gap between one node failing and the other one starting to work. It's clusters, it's high availability. So if you have license with SA, software assurance, or CSP subscriptions, then your active node requires licenses. Your passive node in that configuration does not. It's free. As long as it's truly passive, as long as all the other kind of limitations apply, it's free. Plus, you may run one instance for disaster recovery in Azure, plus one instance for disaster recovery on premises or even on a provider, except listed providers. Disaster recovery means it's not a cluster. It must not be a member of the same cluster. It's another node that you manually, so the requirement is it needs to be manually spun up. In case of a disaster, I don't know, fire happened in your main data center. But that's how many SQLs you may have for any so-called, I could probably say backup purposes for free without additional licenses. As I said, disaster recovery license instances cannot be turned on manually. Software assurance is required. And if you use server CAL model, CALs also require software assurance. CSP subscriptions have SQL failover rights, exactly as they say. And importantly, all these instances must basically have the same licensing requirements. So 8 cores, 8 cores, 8 cores, 8 cores. See what I mean? So your reserve node may not be more powerful than the one that you're protecting. But normally, as admins do this, they usually deploy almost like an identical copy of the original instance. And therefore, that problem doesn't just exist. Previous versions of SQL Server, actually, well, before 2019, had fewer nodes. So if you have old licenses, check product terms for that version, because maybe you only had 2 instances allowed. Or if you use licenses of SQL Server 2012, for example, only 1 instance was allowed, not 3. So Microsoft actually adds more benefits with new versions. Here are the workloads that are permitted on the reserve instances, so the ones that you don't need licenses for. Database consistency checks, or CheckDB, log backups, full backups, monitoring usage data. That's it. No reports, no user access, we need to offload something to this node. No, then it becomes active and it requires a license. So as long as you play by these rules, it's free. Good news for those of you who are in Azure, that is something that didn't make sense for a long time. I really just couldn't understand why Microsoft wouldn't allow it. Is now when you rent SQL Server in Azure, you can have, not completely free, but with 0 licensing costs, additional instances or managed instances or virtual machines for failover purposes, as on this slide. That's a new change, as far as I remember, introduced in December 2022, so a few days ago, really, which is great news for those of you who use SQL Server in Azure, because previously you actually had to pay for passive instances on the pay-as-you-go model. If you used Azure Hybrid Use Benefit, no, you didn't have to, because that would include SQL failover rights through Azure Hybrid Use Benefit. But now it's available on pay-as-you-go, which is nice. Right. Let me answer some of your questions, because we are moving on to the next section soon. How managed SQL Server instance differs from SQL Server database and virtual machine? So virtual machine is a virtual machine, like you have access to the full computer, it's your computer. SQL Server managed instances, you don't see the operating system that runs it. They give you access to the managed instance. It's your server. You can reconfigure it, change settings, change collection orders, manage like SQL Server itself, but you don't have access to the Windows server on which that SQL Server runs. So you only have access to managed instance. Database is an even smaller fraction of that. You don't get access to the instance. Instance is managed by Microsoft. They give you one database. So you have very limited capabilities of what you can do with that database or instance or anything else. You choose what you want. If you have a website, I would probably choose database, because that's the easiest option. If you have a complex application, you may go with the managed instance. If you want full control of everything, every single aspect, then go with virtual machine. It's basically the level of access that you have, the level of management that you offload to Microsoft or you do yourselves. If I use bring your own license choice for SQL hosted by a provider, would we need to consider the Windows Server license accounts on which my SQL Server instances run? No, well, you mix and match. On hosting, you can rent virtual machines from them with a server, just basically through the normal mechanisms of procuring virtual machines. And then you can tell them, we want to deploy SQL Server. Would you allow us to bring our own license? Always tell them, because otherwise you'll be in a non-compliant situation. And they will instruct you. They will tell you, okay, fine, we're okay with that. Bring your own license. So you may pay for Windows Server through pay-as-you-go, or on their side it's going to be SPLA, but you may deploy in the same virtual machine. You may deploy SQL Server licenses that are yours. It's possible. So you don't have to think about Windows Server licenses if you don't want to. What kind of SQL editions can a Visual Studio subscriber licensee install and use a non-prod? So as far as I remember, if it's a Visual Studio subscriber, they have access to both enterprise and standard, unlimited instances for non-production purposes. I still recommend using developer because it's just easier. Because if you give access to that SQL to another developer, they also need a full Visual Studio license. If you give access to SQL Server Developer Edition to another developer, they don't need a new license, which may be $1,000 per year, something like it. So SQL, as far as I remember, SQL is included in every Visual Studio subscription. I may be wrong, but I think it is. Yeah, both standard and enterprise. Right, getting close to the end. And remember, we're going to discuss some cost-saving options as well. Software assurance considerations. So, what do I need software assurance or not? So, Microsoft basically is twisting our arms now, especially with this new thing that you may not assign a license to virtual machines without software assurance. Well, by the way, I might need to correct some of the slides. Well, that's it. So, do I have a mistake in that slide? Yeah, I do. Sorry, I'll correct it. I'll publish it on our LinkedIn page. So, license per VM, per core, standard or enterprise requires software assurance. So, Azure Hybrid Benefit requires software assurance. SQL Fail-over requires software assurance. License mobility in server farms for the license to move with the virtual machine requires software assurance. Flexible virtualization, bring your own license, requires software assurance. And well, license mobility through software assurance is another bring your own license benefit for not only for listed providers, it also requires software assurance, as you may see from its name. So recommendations, the recommendations that we have is assume that you need software assurance by default unless you know that you don't, unless you're absolutely sure that you don't. Have software assurance on cows. Don't forget about cows. And keep software assurance. If you're migrating to Azure, keep software assurance. It may be cheaper to take licenses on which you're only paying a fraction of annual cost, which is pure software assurance, to Azure than pay-as-you-go rates. Because if you forget about that and then you think, oh, I'll buy CSP subscriptions. CSP subscriptions may be even more expensive than Azure pay-as-you-go in some circumstances. So AHAB for SQL is a bit of a tricky area. You need every time you need to check whether you're saving anything or not. But if you only pay for a say on a license that you bought many years ago and you continue renewing software assurance, continue renewing it and take those licenses to Azure. Somebody asked this question, Namrat, I think, a few days ago in one of the Telegram groups dedicated to software asset management. And I gave the same answer. If you're only paying for a say, continue paying for a say, renew, take them to Azure. It's going to save you a little bit of money. For SQL Fail-over, obviously for VM mobility, for bring your own license. So software assurance should be considered. I understand it's an ongoing subscription. I don't like subscriptions myself, but it's the reality. The reality we cannot fight. So CSP considerations, SQL through CSP. Please remember that perpetual licenses do not have software assurance benefits. Don't consider perpetual licenses. Only consider them if you know what you're doing exactly. It's a static physical server that's not going to be upgraded. That's not going to be moved, not going to be virtualized. Fine then. Software assurance does not exist in CSP. However, subscription licenses have equivalent rights. They have flexible virtualization, they have Azure hybrid benefit, they have equivalency to license mobility in server farms. So CSP subscriptions for SQL Server are almost equal to volume licenses with SA. So the bottom line on this slide is consider subscriptions first and perpetual license only when you know what you're doing. And that'll probably be like 1% of you. Top 6 cost saving tips on SQL Server. What we find is I was involved in not many, I wouldn't say there were many, but high profile, usually banks with large SQL Server estates in SQL Server optimization exercises. And what we do always, if there's such an engagement, is we send questionnaire to all the DBAs and application owners. What SQL Server Enterprise features do you require? And there's a very short checklist. Difference between SQL Server Enterprise and SQL Server Standard. In more than 80% cases, they come back with, no, we don't require them at all. And the company, the bank, is paying for SQL Server Enterprise. So there may be an option, not always, to switch to SQL Server Standard then. That's a cost-saving option. Because some admins just deploy Enterprise because well, it's the best addition, but it's 4 times more expensive than Standard. So do that review on your SQL Server Enterprise instances. You may be, shockingly surprised by how many instances you may down addition to Standard. Or downgrade. I mean, call it downgrade in this case. It doesn't matter really. The second saving tip is use SQL Server Developer for non-production. Because as I just mentioned, with Visual Studio, if you then give access to other developers, what many companies forget is that everyone who has access to Visual Studio software, MSDN software, needs an MSDN license. And then you end up in a situation when there are 200 people and only 10 and 20 licenses, and then you're non-compliant, and you have to pay audit fees, audit penalties. SQL Server Developer frees you up. It's free. All you need to do is register and then use it for non-production workloads. Technically, it's an equivalent of SQL Server Enterprise. I mean, I had people arguing with me that it's not, but it is. Consolidate SQL servers in dedicated clusters. But I have a next slide. I'll show you when it doesn't work. So before thinking about consolidation is usually beneficial when done right. When you have high capacity dedicated clusters for production active workloads with the right set of editions, then it makes sense. So consolidation. Think about hardware clusters. Remember, I told you that hardware clusters devirtualize, move it to the physical layer, but deploy tool servers with multiple instances. Consolidate databases. You may even downgrade from enterprise to standard, still getting the same benefits. Standard supports clustering. Surprise! Not everybody knows about it, by the way. Use AHAB if you only pay for Azure Hybrid Use Benefits in Azure. If you pay software assurance, you'll have a big discount. You won't get the same level of discount in Azure anyway. And don't forget about SQL Fail-over and bundled licenses, because that's what we see sometimes in in-house reviews, where they do a review without involving an expert, or they do a review through an LSP who doesn't care about getting nitty-gritty into details. They count every single server instance, and they license every single server instance with licenses, forgetting about that. For example, SQL comes with System Center. SQL comes with Azure DevOps Server. Passive instances, as I explained to you in SQL Server Fail-over, they're free of charge. Don't forget to exclude them. I mean, there's a reason why I put it on this slide. It's a massive mistake that's done by many companies that don't follow the process properly. I had a customer who had to pay a huge fine for having developer edition and non-prod because, according to the auditor, they had the installations there permanently. My question is there a time limit on it? No, there's no time limit. There's a time limit on evaluation edition. Maybe they had evaluation. Maybe you misinterpreted. But I wouldn't be surprised if an auditor made a mistake. I promised you to show you when unlimited virtualization doesn't work. So we have a cluster here with 4 nodes, 24 cores. These days it's a pretty weak server configuration, so nothing fancy. I mean, these days it's probably going to be like 34 cores and 32 cores and more. In this configuration, each virtual machine runs on 8 virtual cores, so I simplified it a little bit. But this was taken from a real life example. When we had to show to the customer that licensing with SQL Server Enterprise at the hardware level, even on a almost purely SQL Server dedicated cluster, costed them almost twice compared to licensing individual virtual machines. And the reason was there's not enough density of licensable instances. And also, if you remember, standard is 1/4 of the cost of enterprise. So if you have a mixture like this, development in the same cluster, passive nodes in the same cluster, empty virtual machines or Linux virtual machines in the same cluster, then you dilute the compute capacity of the cluster and you don't get the benefit of consolidation in this case. So by all means, consider that as an option of cost saving, but don't just blindly go with for unlimited virtualization and end up in a situation like this. And one of my first clients in the United Kingdom, it was in 2013, I was shocked. They licensed every single core in the main production cluster with SQL Server Enterprise, and they were running 1 or 2 VMs per host. Millions of pounds wasted. Right, so for the next session, we did 2 polls, and I told you, please follow us on LinkedIn. Please follow us on this channel. Go to the community tab on the channel. We publish polls for the next training sessions. So the training session is in January. You decided that it's going to be about licensing in Azure. So all the core aspects, we don't promise to cover every single thing in Azure. It's about licensing in Microsoft Azure. Licensing Microsoft products in Microsoft Azure. It's not a AZ 900 training. No way. Please join us in January. And by the way, with the exception of the next Wednesday, please give us a break in the new year. We're live every Wednesday, 3 o'clock UK time, on this channel, on the SAMexpert TV YouTube channel. And you can see, if you go to our channel homepage, let me stop sharing this. I'll show you what I'm talking about. Please bear with me for a few more seconds whilst I'm switching to that particular window. Yep. Here on our channel homepage, you can see all the upcoming live streams. So you can, if you subscribe to the channel, you can turn notifications on, and YouTube will notify you. But then we're trying to maintain the same cadence, same day of week, same time, and let's see what happens. All of these questions are interactive, and unfortunately, Daryl couldn't join me today. But usually, Daryl is also with me, so you can ask him your questions too. And on the Azure training, I think we will bring our cloud head of the cloud department, chief cloud economist Stefan. Hopefully, he may be able to answer your nitty-gritty, very technical, very in-depth questions about Azure economics. So that's what I'm working on right now. Thanks very much for joining me today. I promised 90 minutes. I think we are somehow approaching 90 minutes. Hope you learned something from this training today. And well, I'll see you soon. I'll see you soon again on our channel, and subscribe and follow. What do I want to show? Do I want to show anything else? Probably not. Anyway, have a great day. And those of you who celebrate any holidays, Hanukkah, Happy Hanukkah, Merry Christmas, and Happy New Year. And I'll see you in the beginning of January. Cheers.